Hey, we're going to try that again, this time with the microphone turned on. We're messing around with a different setup, and now I think it's going to work. I think we're ready to go. Let me get that code turned off. Just a second. Okay, we are going to have a blue background. Let's set the background to black. And we are going to play around today with circles in some sense. I'm going to set the background to black again and make an ellipse. We'll put it at the center of the page. Width divided by 2, height divided by 2, width divided by 2. Let's see what that looks like. All right, we have a giant circle. I'm going to try translating to that place instead. I'm going to cut this and say 0, 0, and put ourselves in the center. I'm going to say no fill and set the stroke to white. All right. Yeah, hopefully you might be seeing better resolution out there today than you did last week if you were joining us in the past, experimenting with 1080p streaming, slowly learning how all this stuff works, slowly getting fancier. All right, so hopefully we have some nice sharp code with some sharp outlines on this thing. And so this is like a basic circle, and I think what I'm going to play with is experiment by making a circle with a bunch of points along those lines of sine and such, and then see what kind of interesting animation we can do from there. So I'm going to say, I'm going to have a loop count that's 50. I is going to be less than this LC. And we're going to calculate an X and a Y based on sine. I is going to have to come in. It's going to need something about pi or 2 pi. I'm going to say, I'm going to just take a fraction at the beginning and say times width divided by 3. Y is basically the same, but a cosine. I times 0.1 times the same thing. See what happens. And then we draw our ellipses at 0, 0, and like 10 big or so, or 50. Or 150. These are super tiny. Because these things probably need to be much, much bigger. They might also need to be, let me see, divided by 2. Let me turn the fill back on. Aha, they're taking up a ton of space. They're all sitting down there in the center. Where are these things? Let me turn off this circle. There they are. If I said LC was 20 or 10, I am doing something wrong. I is less than 0, or I equals 0. I is less than LC. I plus plus. It grows. All right. X. That's what I'm doing. I'm not even using X or Y. What the hell? So let's use those values. I think I was going to translate, but instead I should plug them right in. And that's why we can't see the thing anymore. There we go. Boom. These are huge. Let's make all this stuff smaller. There we go. Yeah, we do or don't want the fill. I don't know. And now we have to figure out the right amount. This is where you have fun Lissajous curves. Lissajous. But I know I need to use pi or something. Pi divided by LC, maybe. That's a half circle, so 2 pi, all right. Yeah, so now I have a bunch of beads. I can turn off that other ellipse. And that was just sort of a starting point for making a circle, but we actually want to draw this circle out of these dots, because then it's fun that these can be like a sine wave of frame count times 0.1 times 50, maybe slower, and using I times 0.5 plus, so that those things can have some kind of rhythm to them. Those numbers are always fun to play with to find out what the relationship should be. We can make some Ajax loaders or some like flashy lights for a talk show. I think I might need to adjust the volume a bit and make that gain not so much if I'm talking downward. Just say something if the audio is a little too loud. Okay, so that's like if I want these things to change over time, but I think before I start manipulating their size, I'd like to animate them a bit to give them some motion going in and out. And to do that, I think I need to play with this value here. Or no, actually this value, how far out these things sit. That's if it's, yeah, these different values, I could get the things to go in and out, could be kind of interesting. So I'm going to say let off equal with divided by 4. And that's the exact same, just with a variable. And then what happens if this ends up being a value that changes? If I go like 10 plus this as a sine wave. Or even slower, that's going pretty fast. Even slower, there we go. But then they should be at their own speed. That creates an interesting trippy loop. What if it's 0.1, 0.2? Ooh, some interesting patterns. I think at the very least we should trace a little bit of this image. Oh, that makes such a difference. If it's clearing all the time or leaving an image, I think I need to name this thing so that when I save a screenshot, I know what it is later. P5Live Sessions. We will call this, we'll call it circles. Yeah, and then maybe it's interesting to play with how big is this thing, so it can be quite immersive. Yeah, once you go too large, then it starts to lose that smooth shading that it has. That's what it's like if it's a small cluster. Let me go back to 4. And let me also turn this off. So I'm back to just a normal circle. And I should also try rotating this thing, which I think would be involved here. Whoa, we need more tracing. Yeah, so this ends up creating like a phase change. If it was if this was a Lisa Zhu curve, you're just sort of seeing that circle give you this faux rotation. We can slow that way down. And then if I give both of them that value, then we get this rotation motion. Instead of just one of those frequencies being different, they're the same. So maybe this is interesting to give it like a rot for rotation. That way I could change that number on the fly. And maybe it's interesting that I is involved in there somehow. This is all going into a sine wave, so I could say like I times 0.5 plus. And then they join some kind of group rhythm. 0.5 was pretty nice. And then I turn this back on and see what happens when those things are moving in a crazy way. And maybe allowed to get bigger. And maybe change their size. Maybe go smaller again. 4. Yeah, then it really depends how long do you trace for? How complex do those images get? If I turn off background altogether, it eventually fills the page. Okay, let me turn this back to just the plane, same size. And turn off rotation. And see what these different numbers do. Because this is where, yeah, it's just the base setup for having a circle. And then there are so many different combinations that are going to make such a difference. 2, 5, 0, 5. Creates a kind of slinky dink like thing. That makes a nice shading on the inside and outside. I should try again what it's like without that fill. If it's giant, starts to look a little bit like some kind of seashell creature. Maybe it's interesting to let this thing get really big and keep the stroke weight quite small. Hopefully it's not too compressed out there. Let's let it get even wider. And maybe it should actually go slower. Where's the speed? I think it's this guy. That leaves some pretty nice traces, and actually I should let this fade a bit longer. What about? Yeah, there's so many different numbers here to experiment with. And it makes such a big difference when these are just small little shapes and we can actually see what their trajectory is versus making these things gigantic and they just become kind of shading, circular shadings. That's somewhere in the middle. I think it's still worth testing a few other patterns, a few other speeds for this thing. Wow, that makes some nice iris-like qualities in the center as it opens up. Let me go back down to a small size so I can see what these things are doing. And this is with it going in a positive and negative direction for this off. I'm curious what it's like if I do an absolute value on this. So it can only go in and out. So it'll be like a ping pong. Could be interesting. Whoops, if I make this 3 or 4, so I can see the whole thing. It's kind of interesting. Instead of going across from one side to the other, they just go forward and back. This is pasta vision, penne vision. It might be interesting to have 2 different sets of these things, one doing this smaller scale stuff and one doing like a large scale in the background. This is if we really push those circles to just kind of blast a lot of sizes. Yeah, what happens if I have 2 of these things? What if I only have like 20 of them? And let them get further apart from each other. Yeah, they kind of have a mechanical quality. Maybe it's interesting to add a few more, either 15 or 20. And then reactivate this rotation. Whoa, which is way too fast. Oh, 5. Curious if I can make them bigger without making those lines too far apart. Oops, number 2. Without making those lines too visible, I have to slow something down so that the shading stays there. Right now they have this really obvious ellipse quality. And that's a question about one of these things moving too fast. I think it's this frame count maybe here. Maybe this one as well. And then you have to wait for it. Let's see what else should be affected. Ah, maybe this is... No, that's just the rhythm at which those things are going inside and out. Yeah, maybe it's interesting soon to get a second set of these things running. Ooh, that was an interesting number at 5.3. Made this nice kind of circular infinity. Wow, that's a nice combination of what they can do. What if I make them a bit smaller so I can see the whole thing? Yeah, I'm curious if they are... No, they're just running in a circle. Yeah, interesting how that created 2 circles from that specific value. 5.3 and 5.4 I think is something totally different. And 5.5. Yeah, something interesting about 5.3. What was 5.2? There's kind of a funny hiccup in the center when they meet. 5.3. And if I have even more of them, okay, that totally changes the rhythm. Interesting. $50 of them, back to 50, 60, 70. You can see how many it takes until the fan starts to kick on. Yeah, I think at a certain point it just gets chaotic and we can't really tell what's happening. Interesting to play at both at different fade in and outs and stroke thicknesses, what difference this makes. Could be interesting to activate WebGL in a minute and see how do these things act different in 3D. Yeah, so with a pretty solid background, that's just those things moving in space. But they become totally different as they trace themselves out. And of course they could have different fills. We can see what this thing looks like if we give it a solid fill, maybe for maybe the smaller one. I don't know, I have to play with which is better. Oops, I think it has to be the other way around. Okay, that just becomes like an empty donut-like thing. Versus playing with just a stroke there. Maybe it's interesting if there's a certain opacity on them so we can quasi see through them. Not so much. But there is something interesting about having them cover up the previous tail. So I'm going to play with this adjusted size one again. Whoa, where those things are changing way too fast, or something is moving too fast. Or maybe it's just the strangeness when this thing has an absolute value. If they seem smoother when they're allowed to run through without bouncing back. Which they kind of do anyways. 200 of these things. 300. We have some googly eyes here. 400 of them, or drop this back down to just 40 of them. Yeah, where else do I want to go from this? We started out trying to make a circle. We now have this other thing happening. It might be interesting too. That's kind of a nice like swimming motion that they're making. Interesting that they're only doing it on one side though. At 20, it was quite interesting. Wonder if I go up to 50, can I get this to happen again on both sides? Or maybe I let one of these more chaotic ones just take over and have no background and see what this is like tracing a larger image out, which we couldn't do before because everything was eventually going to white out. And then maybe try a different relationship, but start it over. Yeah, that makes a nice braid. I like the movement that these things are doing, kind of wiggling back and forth, swimming around each other. Of them. And maybe it's interesting to let these things get even bigger. I'll slow it down and let them get even larger. It starts to get a little bit like some kind of etching relief. I think I still need to slow down that speed. I'm going to make this half as fast. And maybe even let them get even bigger. They'll quickly erase each other. So then maybe it is good not having too many of these things, but letting them take a further path and travel quite a ways. Maybe they just need kind of odd numbers here instead of being such perfectly fitting numbers. Make sure they are something that won't repeat so much. This looks like some kind of silk larva farm. Yeah, this is like drawing with blobs. Maybe it's interesting if their fill kind of changes, pulses in and out, so they're not always erasing in the same way. I'm curious what happens if this is like a sine. Times 255. That'll be way too fast. Slow it down and use I to make some kind of offset, so that they're each different from each other. And I think the speed at which they grow and shrink also needs to be way more varied. They should be somehow using I so that they're having their own speed at which they move. So let's try using. That's way too much. We need to shrink that way down. So some of them will be way fast, some of them will be, or actually quite slow and slower. Maybe it's better that they're just simply going quite slow. And just have to play with what this offset is, what the right amount is that these things are different than each other. I'm hypnotized. Haven't changed too much out of this code because it is hypnotizing. I think if I play with the stroke size being thinner, even more moire effects will appear. Maybe it's interesting that that stroke weight, or rather the stroke color, becomes like an opposite of what its fill is, so they're not always having this white. I'm going to turn this into a variable and call it, use this for a fill color, and let this be 255 minus it. So now they're kind of inverts of each other. We've gotten way, way far away from a circle. Could also be interesting to bring it back to being a circular form and then push it out in some other way. So to try and bring it back, maybe I leave this as one thing and clone it and bring it back to being a circular form, or a blob rather. Interesting what it became. It's just kind of like this mobbling, blobby form. Kind of fun. Leaves a nice border on the outside. It's always interesting what this ratio does between the size of how each of these things should be. There's always some really interesting combinations that bring them in sync with each other in some way. Okay, but they've got this off movement that's sending them in and out, and I'm gonna close that off for a minute, and I think I could just override it here and say off equals width divided by 5. There we go. So now I'll fade out again. Ooh, now we just have this kind of interesting sparkling ring. Maybe it's interesting to let that number just kind of expand and shrink, so it could be that amount plus a sign times like width divided by 10, or even less, and even slower. So it just has like the ability to kind of pulse in a way. But I can already tell that makes some quite interesting patterns. Wow, as it moves slow. So I think I'm going to keep it that pattern, but let this thing get way bigger. And at the same time, probably have to slow it down exponentially. So it like very slowly builds a bigger size in both directions. Let's see what happens. I'm going to start it over. It leaves quite a metallic looking surface. Save a couple screenshots along the way. Control S. Yeah, again, that's a thing in P5Live. Every time you press Control S, you end up getting a screenshot of the PNG and the code at that state, because I keep changing the code. So it's nice that then you can go back and just drag and drop that sketch into the window and see where you were again. So now we get to watch it slowly build itself in the outward way. It needs to go even further. Is it gonna expand even more? It's supposed to totally immerse us. Bummer, I don't think it is. So I get a quick screenshot, has that interesting metallic quality, and I'm going to say that this is actually an absolute value here and that it can get much bigger. There we go. So now it's expanded totally beyond the screen, and I think I'm going to cheat and tell the var frame count to start off at some value. And what this does is it like overrides the frame count, which is constant It's always growing and growing and growing when you do a soft compile. But this way I can force the frame count to be a certain value and grow from there. It of course would be nice if all those shapes were alive and were actually like wobbling around, but this is just tracing out an image. Could also see how many of these things we could handle holding on to in a buffer, but I'm skeptical of that many. And now the thing got way too big and went off the screen. There it is, it's coming back. I think I also need to test it once, turning off the fill and let the thing just do the stroke. Let's see what that's like. If I turn off fill and say no fill and start it from scratch. And now the thing should really start from the very center. So I'm gonna get rid of this start off at 5 and tell it start over and see what that looks like. Yeah, this is called slow processing, setting up a process to do something for you in a extended process. And now that thing should really be moving around, and that is where some visual feedback could give us that quality. I try not to overdo visual feedback, but it can be a nice way to let things that are kind of moving, or not moving, but are static, have like a little bit of life to them. So let's clone this. Get one more shot as it gets to the center. Okay, and let's take a clone. So what is this thing? This is like circles drawing zoom. And I'll clone it. And maybe we'll give it a name once we know what it's doing. But let's add a little bit of feedback to this. Actually, I forget, I don't need create graphics. I need to create an image, or I think it really doesn't make a difference. I'm going to say FB is a get of the whole canvas. And that will probably slow me down a lot, so sometimes I resize the thing. Somehow cutting down the resolution of it. I could also play with the pixel density, and then I need to display that thing. We should also make image mode centered. Whoops, already centered. And force the image to be the full width and height. There we go. So it becomes a little bit soft. It's nice feedback. You only need about 3 or 4 lines to create feedback. We're losing a bunch of that resolution that was there. So I should test once not resizing. Whoops. And see if that was really necessary. The fan is definitely going to kick up. But like this, it's 1-to-1. So actually there's no feedback right now. Or we can't really see it. And then I should create like a slight zoom, I think. So it's just barely moving into this thing. And then we get these interesting artifacts that happen as it sort of blends out. So I'm going to start it over one more time. And in previous sessions, played around with the pixel density, which at certain numbers causes all kinds of really interesting effects to happen. We lost a lot of the quality, unfortunately, by doing that effect, that zooming into it. So that's kind of a bummer. I'm going to turn that off so it's like 1-to-1 ratio right now and mess with the pixel density, which by default is 2 on this laptop. And at 1, I'm kind of surprised it still looks the same. 1.1, I think it was 1.4 gave this, yeah, we can already see it getting kind of crunched. I think 1.4 created some interesting artifacts there. We can already see kind of pixelated moires appearing. So these are like low res artifacts. I should probably make sure, I wonder if I don't have no smooth on. I wonder if that would make a difference and force these things to be really sharp pixels. Let me say no smooth. Yeah, there we go. So now I think it's keeping much harder pixels, which is nice for zooming into that image. You can rescale it at any size using nearest neighbor. And now that hard pixels are on, I'm also going to let it zoom into the thing a bit and see if it keeps some of those details. Great, we get some different details. We get some interesting streaky details. Interesting. Yeah, we'll see what happens as it zooms back into the middle and paints over the center. But in some ways it's way too static. It's really taking that square and stretching it out. So let's play with either the zoom or the pixel density to break up that consistency. Is what a future microprocessor will look like once we have like pixel connections between the chip and all the circuitry. Yeah, I guess as I zoom into this thing, it just starts ripping it apart. I'm going to keep the zoom low and tweak the pixel density here. So this is at 1.1. We get an interesting artifact. These really square, blocky guys. Getting some nice accidental low res. What about 1.2? Start it over one more time. Probably should have taken a screenshot as that expanded. Eventually, I will integrate shaders into these kinds of improvisations. Haven't played with them enough to mess about without hitting all kinds of bugs. But I think that could be another aspect where you kind of get a certain quality over the entire image. I'm going to say 0.9, which will destroy it in a different way, getting a bit more pixelated. And then it might be nice to turn off the feedback altogether. Oh, damn, disappeared. Interesting. Why did it disappear when you turn off the feedback? Strange, I would have expected. Interesting, we don't have a background on. Is it because of this pixel density? That's doing it. Interesting. Okay. That means this needs to be on some kind of on-demand. So I need to say like, whoops, that can stay there. This should be down below, so it's okay if we're constantly showing the image, I can mess with the pixel density. Or not. That's weird. I could when it was up here. Ah, strange. I can't do it after translating. Interesting. Interesting. Glitch or a feature, I'm not sure. Okay, but anyways, I should do like a toggle that thing being on and off. So I'll say use feedback equals false. And then say if use feedback, do that thing. And also down here. And so now there is no feedback. Yeah, so now it's like a hybrid of a pixelated center with a really smooth outside. And still have to hook up a key to be able to press. Let's use F for feedback. This thing equals not itself. So then I should be able to press F, and there we have the feedback. So I can toggle this thing on and off, and now I'll do the opposite. Have like a pixelated outside and a really smooth inside. And mess with this pixel density again. 0.2, for example. 0.1, totally blurry. Jump to 2. What does that look like? Start it over at 2. That's where it's supposed to be on this Retina display. And we turned off scaling. Oh no, it's just barely on. Maybe feedback is turned off. Maybe that's why. It is turned off. There, now it's on. Right, because I said by default be off. Maybe by default be on. And then interesting to let it grow a little bit of pixelation, expand, grow a bit of pixelation, expand. But I think now it's zooming way too much because I didn't think it was working before. So now this is like just barely zooming out. Yeah, I got quite set on this particular design. I'm going to turn off the feedback for a minute and tweak. Let's clone the sketch. And maybe it's interesting to test out where some of those previous designs were with this kind of feedback setup. So I'm going to, what do I need to change? I'm going to change how much this thing is going offset, bring it back down to the center. Maybe change the rhythm at which the thing was moving. And so, yeah, that was this thing in general was affecting it. That was it. With all kinds of blurble things. If I turn on feedback while it's doing this like bubbling in the center, might be interesting. Just kind of creates a bunch of streaks going off the side. If I disable that no fill and let it have a fill, and maybe go back to this other offset. What did that do? And what if I did the opposite? If I said, we have this fill and we have no stroke, so it only has the shading. Here's something else to try. So it's not as much about lines and fine details, but more about these Yeah, just these shadings. Let me let the thing... What do I have to do? I disabled it moving about. No, that's how it was. Oh yeah, true. It should go up to like 0.2. So now this gets to build a larger shape. But I think the feedback zoom is on so low that inner shape doesn't really change. If I set the scale a bit higher and play with the pixel density. Trying to remember what those numbers were. It's kind of guess and check. There were a couple interesting positions in the middle that really made the feedback kind of collapse in an interesting way. All right, where should it go in the last stages? I'm going to bring the stroke back on. Turn that fill off and let it do some totally different pattern. And maybe limit how many of these things there are. And maybe this is based on a bigger size, so these things can sit further out on the canvas doing their movement, leaving streaks for the feedback to pick up. Although we're getting this constant zoom in, so that's where it could be interesting to actually... There we're getting just some sort of like low-res moire effects from having turned down the pixel density without actually zooming. I could say 0.999. So it's going to slightly zoom inward, like crunch itself. What if I go back to 1:1? And something I haven't done since the beginning, we've been drawing with ellipses the whole time. Tried out rectangles. Nope, back to ellipse. Had to try it. Add a ridiculous number of these things. Yeah, not a whole lot to narrate, just testing other numbers, seeing what it's like. It's really tempting to have it at this like really crunched low res level. You could create it in some other software, but interesting to see those sharp edges generate those shapes. Let the thing get a little bit bigger. or to play at levels just below retina and see if that creates any particular artifacts. There we get lots more effects happening and some quite interesting shading on each of those forms. I'm actually going to limit down how many of these things we have. Let's go to just 2 of them, because based on their movement, they're creating an interesting shading. It has this now kind of faux 3D quality to it by having one inside of the other. And I'm guessing they're going to make kind of an infinity loop around each other. They're on this trajectory. Yeah, quite interesting shading there. I'm going to keep it at just 2 and tweak the speed at which these things, like the offset that these things have, and maybe the speed at which they move. Although I have a feeling the speed was exactly where you want it to be to get that shading. Yeah, I think slower was better for the movement to get that shading to appear. Maybe 3 of them is better than just having 2. We're getting a little bit of lag. Maybe because this is at a pretty high density. I'm not sure if I even need the feedback. I do, because without the feedback, I think... no, I don't know. We're not zooming at all. So maybe this is a waste. I should also put this if feedbacking, then it does the get, so we're not wasting any effort to grab a photo if we don't need it. Yeah, now it's much faster. And then you can play with just like a slight different pixel density to get these different kind of artifacts to appear. And what if we have just one of these things moving around on the page on its own? Has a nice transparency to it. Starts to look like some kind of scientific cell that we're looking at. Some electron microscope zoom in. And we're back to a circle with one of these things moving. I'm not sure if it makes a perfect loop. I don't think so. It's on some trajectory. If I quickly turn on 10 of these things, I forget what I had to activate to get back our circle. There it is. So then there is just like a circular movement going in. No, that's for the amount of offset. I was interested to get just one of these things moving around in a circle. Let's let this do its course as we wrap up. Yeah, pretty much the same as what we saw before. Let 2 of them work their way. Yeah, so I hope you have enjoyed checking out some improvised coding. Kind of slow style this evening, letting it just trace images out for us. But tune in next week for something completely different. P5Live Sessions. And now I have to find that outro as the sketches grow. All right, thanks for watching.